I'm Alice. I'm a master's student. I'm doing a criminal justice policy MSc here. I am really interested in prisons. That's the thing that I care about the most. I think a lot of people don't really, either they don't really know what goes on inside prisons, or they don't really know about the impact of what happens in prisons. I got really interested in this stuff after taking a class on the racial implications in the US prison system. And the thing that really got to me the most, it was all very emotional, but the thing that got to me the most was the fact that at the time, in 2011, we were still incarcerating juveniles for life with no possibility of parole. And for me, as like a 17-year-old college freshman, sitting in one of the most expensive liberal arts schools in the US, I kind of realized that there are 17-year-olds right now at that moment sitting in prison for the entirety of their natural born life with no chance of rehabilitation. They're just thrown aside, and the dichotomy was so striking that there were these such disparate classes within the US where that could happen. And at that point I kind of realized that any kind of ambitions I had for law or politics would always be kind of shadowed by the fact that the US does horrifying things to people behind bars. I think with a carceral system that has about 3 million people in it, and that encapsulates such a large disproportionate percentage of African Americans, of the poor, of Hispanics, it's just what you see is people being silenced by incarceration. And whether or not that's actual in terms of that's what the government wants or that's the policies are intended to do, I think is hard to argue, but I think it is easy to look at the effects where you have so many people marginalized. The effects of incarceration in the US mean that as a felon, even when you leave prison, you're not allowed to vote in many states. You can't live in public housing if you have a certain conviction. You sometimes give up your parental rights. You lose a lot of the scholarships, government benefits you would otherwise get. So you have people leaving prison to basically no other alternative than to kind of go back into the system. And it's really difficult to kind of see why the prison system is good at that point, because there's nothing good about the fact you have an institution that doesn't perform its function, which is to punish, rehabilitate, and deter. If you take one of those out of the equation, you don't have a functioning system. And I don't think that that's okay for a society. If you warehouse 3 million people and you continue to do so, even if your rates of incarceration fall, you have still thrown away a lot of human life. And I think that's just really terrible. And that's why I want to spend the rest of my life trying to figure out how to make it better. The rates of incarceration are declining, but I think the treatment of those incarcerated isn't getting that much better. And I really hope that at some point the idea that bad prisons make for a great deterring effect where people say, I don't want to go to prison, it's so terrible. I don't think that's a realistic view in kind of the hardships that you see in a lot of economies across the world today. And I think in the UK the situation is also really real, of people being incarcerated, not having many alternatives, the system growing, US influence in kind of policy making. I think it's a really bad sign. And I think with policy changes that are targeted at making the rights of the offender a priority would help a lot in that. I don't know what else to say. I think it's really important that it doesn't become a we're soft on crime aspect. I think it's more we're becoming aware of the fact that people who commit crimes aren't the other. People who commit crimes are everybody. I think that there are very few individuals in society who haven't walked outside the norms, whether they be like legal or social. And I think the people who get caught for crimes fall within very specific socioeconomic groups. So I think in terms of what the prison system does in reality is it cages and it marginalizes people who are already marginalized in society, and I think that's just a really problematic circle. And I think the more time we spend kind of looking for reasons why they're bad or why they're like somehow criminals are inherently bad and they're the other, the less time we spend looking at functions like education, like housing, like these systemic problems that create crime because they don't offer any kind of external mechanism to help yourself. So you have like communities that are so entrenched in poverty, communities that have such a hard time escaping cycles of violence, and it's because there's no mechanism, there's no institutional mechanism. In the US, I think this is like really salient because you see the public school system collapsing, you see infrastructure. The more and more money is being spent on kind of enforcement and like legal mechanisms, like making sure that there are more police officers on the street, making sure they have more high-tech equipment. And I think it's really hard to see why that's better than putting money in schools. It can only be seen as more politically viable to say, I'm going to put 1,000 new cops on the street, and they're all going to have everything they need to hunt down and imprison people who do wrong, because that's an immediate action. And whereas you say, I'm going to improve the math and reading scores of second graders in Chicago, is so much harder because those are kids, that's a long-term effect, and it's much easier to say, well, crime has fallen this percentage because we've incarcerated this percentage of people. That's a short-termist view in every way, but especially in the fact that those people will eventually get out of prison. And even if they don't, you're still paying more money than you would in most circumstances for other ways to rehabilitate these people. I think like in almost every aspect, community rehabilitation is better than any kind of like carceral system, because you have so many more chances to reintegrate that person, for that person to understand that they have a community. Regardless of the shape the community's in, they still have a group of people who are behind them, who support them, who will help them reintegrate. And I think it's hard to do that when criminals are the other, or when people who offend are the other. I just think the more community alternatives, so restorative justice, where you meet with people who you've offended against and you try to reconcile, is a much more like holistic and appropriate way to deal with a lot of like drug crime and where like there's a victim involved, or property crime and some like assault cases, because it's a lot harder to look at the person in the eye and like not feel remorse and to not want to change, or to want to respect your community more. And I think that's a lot of the key for a lot of like smaller crimes. And I think there's like also this facet of people who don't, they're abolitionists, right, who think that prisons shouldn't be a thing. And I personally don't take that view. I think prisons have a place in society. But I think the way that we think of prisons conceptually right now is very far from that kind of idea. So we need prisons that rehabilitate, reintroduce, pick up skills that might have fallen by the wayside, introduce new skill sets in terms of like jobs to prisoners. So I think that's a really good safety net. And that's ultimately how I think prison should be viewed, as a safety net for people who have fallen out of the system. And in that way, it shouldn't be horrible. It should be appropriate to deal with people's needs. And I don't know if a lot of, well, the thing is, I think a lot of the public would agree, and I think a lot of people do desire less punitive sentences for prisoners and less horrific conditions, but I think it's really hard to fight against when you're kind of faced with the situation of money and politics, and there's this historic kind of trend where punitiveness comes with political campaigns trying to ramp each other up, and that's where I think it all goes kind of wrong. But I have a lot of hope that things can change, and they have started to change. And the more that we think about the fact that we're all humans and we're all fallible, the more we kind of have more empathy, the more empathy we have for people, and the more empathy we have for offenders, and I think the better the situation will get as we kind of progress.